My name's Naomi Booth and I'm a fiction writer and I teach in the English Studies department at Durham University. And today I'm going to talk about positive change in relation to writing fiction about the climate crisis. This is something I think about quite a lot in relation to my own work. My first novel, which is called Sealed, told the story of a heavily pregnant woman in a climate-altered world, and it's often described as a work of eco-horror. In my most recent novel, Exit Management, one of the main characters, Lauren, is haunted by the idea of misplaced objects, in particular at the start of the novel, by an image she sees of an albatross chick with its stomach filled with plastic objects. My fiction work is rarely reviewed without the word dark appearing somewhere in the review copy, and I think I've been drawn to dark genres, to the uncanny in particular as a mode of exploring the climate crisis. I think perhaps I've written from a place of climate anxiety, and I'm interested in fiction that might be anxiogenic, that might try to produce anxiety in the reader. But I find myself increasingly questioning what contribution such fiction might make to questions of the climate, and in particular what role dark genres that aim to produce negative affects such as fear, horror, disgust, anxiety, panic, what role these might have in terms of a context of trying to produce positive change. So today I'm going to talk through some of those questions that I'm often asking myself, with no promise of any definitive answers, but I'm going to pose these questions particularly in relation to the genre of eco-horror. The critic Eula Biss, in her work On Immunity, a brilliant exploration of the ways in which we are connected to the world and to the contaminants around us, says that, like other strongly held beliefs, our fears are dear to us. And what we do with that fear, Biss says, is a central question of citizenship. I've sometimes thought of horror as a genre that poses something similar, that asks us what we are afraid of and what we might do with that fear. Eco-horror is a relatively new genre classification. Eco-horror, to my mind, focuses on the damage done to the natural environment and also the damage the natural environment might do to human actors in return. We might think of eco-horror as a sort of dark cousin to more optimistic new climate genres such as solar punk, which imagines ingenious ways that humans might use technology to overcome the worst effects of the climate crisis. Rather than presenting the world as savable through technology or human action, eco-horror encourages us to see the world as under threat and also as threatening. Horror as a genre historically, I would argue, works against euphemism. It works against any culture's attempt to repress or sanitize the things that most disturb us. As well as amplifying our fears, I've sometimes thought that eco-horror might act as a kind of index of the things we stand to lose through the climate crisis. The critic Catriona Mortimer Sandilands, in her work on queer ecology and melancholy, argues that contemporary cultures produce conditions in which, quote, the everyday relations we have with the more than human world are unmarked, unnamed and ungrievable. That makes it almost impossible, she argues, to recognise the value of what has been lost through climate change. In her view, ecological resistance must insist on a non-normalising relationship to the past, on the perpetual return of the things that contemporary consumer culture has diminished, denied, destroyed and attempted to commodify. Looked at in this way, the ecological work of fiction might be an uncanny act of witness and mourning. Through reading, we might witness together acts of destruction that would otherwise be hidden from sight. But does any of this produce positive change? I can think of many rebuttals to my attempts to find value in dark ecological fiction. And I have to admit here to my own agnosticism about literature producing positive change in any easily quantifiable or straightforward way. Some environmentalists have raised specific objections to horror as a mode of engaging with the climate crisis. David Wallace Wells, for instance, in The Uninhabitable Earth, criticises stories of global warming that offer, quote, escapist pleasures, even if that pleasure often comes in the form of horror. He cautions against treating the end of the world as entertainment from a privileged vantage point through which those who aren't yet directly affected by the worst elements of climate change imagine the worst scenarios playing out. The aesthetics and ethics of eco-horror are complex, and it's right to interrogate them. The way in which they position the reader or viewer in relation to suffering is important for us to think about, and is important for me to think about as a writer. And if there is a pleasure that comes from horror, as there undoubtedly is, there might also be a fine line between horror and despair. Rebecca Tamash, in her recent collection of essays, Strangers, describes the emergence of the term climate grief as a way to describe the emotional affect produced as people witness and are affected by climate change. Tamash reminds us that grief can be a powerful index of loss, but she says it can also be a close bedfellow to despair. She quotes Ellie O'Hagan, for example, who describes climate grief as, quote, the sense that what climate change could bring is so massive and so devastating that people have begun to mourn and to slide into a state of abject despair. Tamash writes that it's understandable but also dangerous for us to slip into affects such as despair, despondency and frozen horror. Despairing might excuse our failure to make changes for those who are more vulnerable, for example. Despair, she says, is a vortex, whereas climate grief could yet emerge as a force for climate change in the West. Where does eco-horror stand in all of this then? Might it contribute towards a frozen, despairing state? Some scholars have attempted to undertake empirical research to track the impact of climate fiction on readers' attitudes towards the climate emergency. Matthew Schneider-Meyerson, for instance, has produced several such studies, but the results are somewhat inconclusive. He says, my results suggest that cli-fi reminds readers of the severity of climate change. However, the emotional responses of many readers suggest that most works of climate fiction are leading readers to associate climate change with intensely negative emotions, which could prove counterproductive to efforts at environmental engagement or persuasion. So here we're back to that difficult question of the relation between negative affect and positive change. The pessimism of some of the worst case scenarios in the discourse in the West around climate change has also been rightly critiqued as prioritising and universalising Western capitalist modes of production. Caitlin Greenidge, for example, recently wrote that too often the world is literally burning rhetoric tips over into humans are the virus and we will always screw up the world, ignoring the fact that other cultures have consistently managed to find ways to live in the natural world without destroying it. Climate pessimism in the West, then, might risk discounting indigenous cultures and non-Western approaches to the non-human world. And a non-specific despair at humanity might hide the very specific intentions and actions that are taken every day and accelerate the climate crisis. Catherine Youssef makes this point in more detail in her brilliant work, A Billion Black Anthropocenes, or None. If the Anthropocene, she says, proclaims a sudden concern with the exposures of environmental harm to white liberal communities, it does so in the wake of histories in which these harms have been knowingly exported to black and brown communities. I want to challenge the racial blindness of the Anthropocene as a willful blindness that permeates its comfortable suppositions and its imaginaries of the planetary. Recently, other critics, such as Jason Moore, have favoured the term Capitalocene over Anthropocene to help us think about the damage done to the planet through long-standing capitalist, colonialist and racist modes of extraction and plunder. Moore argues that webs of life have been organised in fundamentally unequal and destructive ways for centuries, and that a focus on, for instance, simply cutting emissions doesn't go anywhere near what is needed to challenge long-standing systems of exploitation. So where does this leave us in terms of my initial question about literary genres, negative affects and positive change? The truth is, I don't really know. Horror might be an effective means of increasing anxiety. Its capacity to compel us to look at horrific things, to insist on the salience of our fears, is its potential power. And yet its particular pleasures might also be tendentious and escapist, and perhaps even despair-inducing. I don't know if there are any literary modes that reliably produce positive change, and perhaps to even formulate that question is to overlook the complex, embedded nature of texts in their environments. All I can say in conclusion is that I remain fascinated by stories that show us that the things that we have hidden inside of us also belong to the environment outside of us. Toxins, microplastics, forever chemicals, even our most intimate experiences of fear and loss and love. Thanks so much for listening.